In this video we're just going to have a bit of fun and talk about the what-ifs for the biggest what-if at all, that is Operation Sealion. I believe that talking about the what-ifs is useful because it does make us examine what actually happened and suggest the alternatives. Let's have a look at some of the things we're going to talk about. So first of all, there's the Battle of Britain. And we can talk about German secret agents and intelligence, a solution to the German torpedo problem, the position of Italy and the start of the war, the poor relations between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, which could have been a lot better, the position of Spain, and the possibility of earlier invasion preparations, and another critical one, of course, is the destroyers' destruction at Narvik, and another one is the way the German transport ships were lost. Another possibility was that Hitler actually makes a proper peace proposal to the British instead of expecting them to come up with one. Of course, another is that the BEF is captured. So let's talk about the Battle of Britain. How could the Germans have won that? Well, many people say, well, that's impossible, but then they will say, oh, but radar was crucial to the British victory. And there are several ways the Germans could have defeated the British radar. First of all, they flew a Zeppelin along the British coast prior to the war trying to detect radar signals, but listened on the wrong frequency and didn't detect anything. Well, if they'd used the right frequency, they would have detected it. And they actually knew how to jam radar, British radar, using such things as window, but they were afraid to use it because they felt that if they'd used it, the British would use it on them, because they had working radar stations at that stage as well. The British also used only a few low-level attacks on the airfields, and they were quite successful in that they did surprise the targets. So perhaps they could have used more low-level attacks and gone under the radar. Another thing the British could have done is they could have bombed or cut the power to the radar stations, and of course they only tried that once or twice. They should have done it every day. And one thing that people don't realise is that the receiving towers for the radar stations were made of wood, which would have made them quite vulnerable to bombing attacks, although perhaps it was easy to rebuild them. Another thing the Germans could have done during the Battle of Britain is conducted a more systematic bombing campaign. They just didn't really have any real plan to what they did or didn't hit. And they often hit the wrong airfields that were like a Fleet Air Arm airfield or a backup airfield or something like that. And they would also have to bomb the engine factories and not switch to bombing London. It seems when you read the history of the Battle of Britain that it goes through several phases, starting with the Channel battles, and it seems like the Germans are just about to achieve something when they decide to change their strategy. Perhaps if they continued with even one of those strategies, they might have achieved something. Even with the Channel battles, they did force the British to stop putting shipping through the Channel in daylight until quite late in the war. Of course, it's to be expected that even if they did achieve any of these things, that aircraft production would have continued, that the Empire training plan would have brought in more pilots, and that the transfer of pilots to the north would have continued, so that the Germans would have had to keep fighting in the air. And this was a necessary precondition for the invasion to go ahead, and this is the most fundamental what if at all. But a big problem, of course, was that the Luftwaffe intelligence, and they had no real idea what was going on in Britain, and often people who knew about it didn't want to report the news because it was bad news, or they were in some organization that was part of the Luftwaffe but were in contact with the wrong people, so didn't tell them what they needed to know. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't attack the radar stations, because there was nobody with the technical knowledge who could speak to the right people, even though they had the technical knowledge and knew they needed to be hit. Next, let's talk about the German torpedo problem, which is actually the U-boat torpedo problem, because the aircraft and ships didn't have this problem, because they got their torpedoes from different sources. On the 30th of October 1939, HMS Nelson, the flagship of the Home Fleet, was torpedoed by U-56 near the Orkney Islands. Two of the three torpedoes hitting but failing to explode from they were fired from only 870 yards away, and the crew heard the torpedoes banging against the side of the ship. On board the ship at the time were Churchill, the First Sea Lord Dudley Pound, and the Home Fleet Commander Charles Forbes. And of course, if the Nelson had reacted to this attack the same way the Barham did, then they would have all been killed. So German submarine torpedoes were faulty until 1942, and they failed to explode after hitting their target. After the Norwegian campaign, when the data was analysed back at U-boat headquarters, it was found that 4 attacks were launched on the battleship HMS Warspite, 14 on cruisers, 10 on destroyers, and a further 10 on transports. Yet, out of all that, only 1 transport was sunk. And Dönitz concluded that had the torpedoes not failed, they would have probable sinkings of 1 battleship, 7 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and 5 transports. In summary, about 20 enemy warships had escaped certain destruction because of torpedo failures. There was also an attack on the Ark Royal, where 3 torpedoes failed to explode. The torpedo problem was discovered during the Spanish Civil War in November 1936, but Oscar Wehr, director of the German Torpedo Trials Establishment, said the problem lay with the users. He blamed them on inexperienced crews arming detonators and setting running depths incorrectly. And he said there was no problem with the torpedoes, because he was defending his own position, and the problems were not investigated. When Wehr was dismissed in December 1939, his successor confirmed that the torpedoes were faulty within a week. This suggests that the problem could have been recognised during the Spanish Civil War and some sort of workaround put in place in time for World War II. The problem was caused by changes in air pressure when a submarine dived and surfaced again, as well as the changes in the Earth's magnetic field at extreme northern latitudes. So the latter problem was fixed by just not using the magnetic fuses and using percussion fuses. The German G7E T3 torpedo was otherwise technically quite advanced. It was electrically powered, so it did not need a bubble wake and was hard to detect. The torpedo had a percussion detonator and a magnetic one, allowing the torpedo to be set to explode when it was underneath its target. There was a tendency for the torpedoes to explode prematurely or not at all. There are also problems with depth keeping. If the solution had been found prior to the invasion, many more Royal Navy ships would have been sunk, and Churchill, the First Sea Lord Dudley Pound, and Home Fleet Commander Sir Charles Forbes, who were on the Nelson, would have been killed and captured. And German submarines would have been more effective at defending the invasion fleet. Hitler had these quirky relations with Britain when he periodically would fall in love with Britain and do something stupid. And one of those was during the negotiations with Britain to allow an enlargement of the German fleet and the building of U-boats. And one of the things he did was to order all of the German spies out of Britain. And that meant that there weren't any useful German spies in Britain during the invasion scare, and they had to send over new ones who were all useless. And it's possible that the famously incompetent, poorly trained and motivated spies sent to Britain during the invasion scare were intentionally placed by the anti-Nazi Admiral Canaris, who was in command of the Abwehr and actively sabotaged the German war effort. One of these spies was caught because he didn't know the British liquor licensing laws and attempted to buy a drink at a pub at the wrong time. In other words, when it was closed. So it's possible that if the German spies had stayed in Britain, they might have been able to do some useful work for the Germans. And as intelligence was one of their biggest problems as far as the Battle of Britain was concerned, and also with Operation Sealion, this would have helped with that situation. It might have meant that they reacted better to their losses in the Battle of Britain and didn't change to attacking London so early. It would also mean that the invasion fleet suffered less from things like the coastal battery hits. Of course, we know that British counterintelligence was very good and that all spies in Britain were found and were eventually interned. But if they'd been more professional and been there for a long time, they might have been able to evade capture long enough to transmit some useful information.